I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Armenian Genocide Commemoration Committee for inviting me here today. And I do so in remembrance of my family members from Aintab who perished in the genocide and in its aftermath. 101 years ago today, thousands of miles from where we stand, the Armenian genocide officially began. The power of this shared history is that each of us carries this within us, and it drives all that we do. The consequences of the Armenian genocide endure 1 century later. We are survivors of this historical trauma. The lasting effects of our experiences will hinge on the future generations comprehending the significance of our genocide. Thus, those yet to be born need to discover the meaning of events that commenced 101 years ago today. It is our responsibility to find ways to reach out to these generations yet to come so that our history of shared loss can resonate. Today we congregated our treasured inspirational Armenian Heritage Park. In fact, 200 memorials commemorating the Armenian genocide exist in 32 countries across the globe. These poignant testaments of our shared history of pain and loss symbolize, as psychiatrists would describe it, the intergenerational trauma that Armenians everywhere struggle with. Starting with the survivors, to their children, to their grandchildren, and then on to the ensuing generations, our genocidal history never resolves. This raises the very question that I would like each of you to consider today. When does a genocide end? We know exactly when ours began, but when did it end? We know that under the Young Turks, the victims were murdered, raped, many taken as sex slaves, others tortured in unspeakable ways, and many more forced on foot to their ghastly deaths starting in 1915. We also know that through the early 1920s, Kemal continued the task of purging Turkey of remnant Armenian populations. A generation was left orphaned. Over time, our industry, our arts, our churches, our language, and all traces of our civilization have slowly vanished from Turkey, many years after Kemal ended his ethnic cleansing. Do we know when the genocide finally ended? I would suggest to you that, in fact, it has never ended. And I ask each of you, should it end? I think not. I think it needs to live on within each of us, and let me explain why. By the grace of God and the hard work of the Armenian people, we have been reborn, are successful, and flourish worldwide wherever we call home. It's not enough to congregate once a year and vow never to forget. It is not enough to battle dishonest and hypocritical political forces to achieve proper recognition of the genocide. We are charged with a higher task. For each of us as descendants of the Armenian genocide, we must choose to be upstanders in our troubled world. The word upstander is a relatively new word being used. An upstander is the opposite of a bystander. A bystander will literally just stand by and watch in the presence of injustice or intolerance or the victimization of other. A bystander just assumes that somebody else will come along and correct a problem that needs to be fixed. Armenians, however, cannot be bystanders. We need to be upstanders in our troubled world. The genocide should never end within our hearts and minds, as it serves the purpose of propelling us to be upstanders. We need to speak out. We need to proactively choose to do what is morally right. We need to be forces for positive, substantive change. We must fight injustice and intolerance wherever we see it, whether large or small, whether locally or globally. We must be responsible for one another. We were given the gift of not merely surviving, but actively thriving as a people. With that gift comes the obligation of being upstanders, standing up, not looking away, when we can individually and collectively make a difference to those who are suffering. Psychologists tell us that when grief becomes a central identity for a people traumatized by mass violence, the grief will unify that society, but can also channel the people in that society to only look inward at themselves and not to look outward to the larger world. As Armenians here today, I ask you to be upstanders, to stand for all victims who bear the devastation of injustice or intolerance, who are brutalized, who lose their property and lose their lands, as did our families a century ago, whether or not today's victims are Armenian. Thus, we find ourselves today in a paradox. Armenians must keep the memory of our genocide alive so we can actively work to end systemic discrimination, violence, and cruelty for all the peoples who suffer today. Today in Turkey, Armenian ghosts wander the vast spaces of Anatolia. These ghosts are restless, unwanted on their native lands. We cannot let the memory of the genocide end, because in its remembrance we honor the dead whom we love and hold dearly. Equally important, though, such remembrance charges us to be a powerful force of much good over the evil that still defies humankind still. Never let us forsake our forebears with indifference. Let us remember the words of one of the heroes of my youth, Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter." Thank you, and may God bless you all.